And bonjour for those of you in French. I don't know any other languages, just those three. So I'm just going to give you a little bit of history about who I am, a little bit of my testimony. You guys probably know that I sit up in the office, been there for a few years, but my story starts a long time ago. Almost 60 years ago, my parents, mechanic, plumber, electrician, pretty much jack of all trades from Bristol, New Brunswick, which is about 20 minutes up the river, and a farm girl from Victoria Square, Ontario, which some of you in the Toronto area might know. That's close to Markham, that's close to Gormley, that's close to Stouffville, Victoria Square. They went to a Bible college called Toronto Bible College, and they met there and got married, decided that missionary work was where the Lord was calling them. So they graduated from Toronto Bible College in 1960, got married in 1961. Then along came a boy who is my big brother. I call him Davy, but it's Mr. Mead, David. And then a year later along came another boy who was my middle brother, Stephen. And they were going through a missionary internship at this time in Toronto and then down to Grand Rapids, Michigan. Then they were posted with SIM to Ethiopia. So they left Canada in 1965 and ventured to the Horn of Africa. And Africa, everybody thinks of Africa as a country. Africa is a huge continent with Ethiopia in the Horn, that's near Somalia, near the Mediterranean Sea, close. Egypt is on top of Ethiopia. Kenya is beside Ethiopia. Tanzania is below Ethiopia. So you've all heard of those different countries in Africa. Ethiopia stretches, if you have any idea geographically, from Newfoundland to Toronto to the Hudson Bay. It's a huge country. When you think of countries in Africa, you don't even think of how big Africa is. You can put most of the other continents into Africa as a continent. That's how big Africa is. So they were in Ethiopia. He was an electrician. He was a diesel mechanic by trade, but his dad owned a machine shop, so my dad knew a little bit of everything. So he started putting in some of the first electricity in Ethiopia. My mom was a nurse, so she worked as a nurse in the Ethiopian clinics. Before a year had passed, though, Mom found out she was expecting a baby. So that's not unheard of, but she was at the time a dorm parent at Bingham Academy, which is a school for missionaries' kids. And she had elementary school boys on one side of her and the grade 8 to 10 girls on the other side, and then Mom and Dad lived in the middle of the dorm. And so in early June of 1966, she went into premature labor 2 months early, and being at high altitude, that wasn't a good thing. She thought she was losing the baby. So she went into the hospital, and in Africa, men aren't allowed in the delivery room. So my dad wasn't allowed in the delivery room, but a baby girl was born, and they said, "You have a baby girl." And then they said, "Oh, you're having another one." And so I am the totally unexpected baby. Like you hear about these oops babies or unexpected babies. I was not expected. I came 10 minutes after my twin sister Ruth, and my parents only had one boy name and one girl name, so because they thought they didn't know no ultrasound in the 60s. So my dad split my mom's name and took the girl's name that they had and split my mom's name, and so each of us have a half of what the baby was supposed to be called and a half of my mom's name. So the baby was supposed to be called Rose Evelyn, and it ended up being Rose Lillian. My mom's name is Lillian, and Ruth, my mom's name is Lillian Ruth. So my twin sister is Ruth Evelyn, and I'm Rose Lillian. So because we were premature and with undeveloped lungs and at high altitude, over 7,000 feet, Mom and Dad had to move in a hurry. School was still in session. but they were able to grab some other staff, and they had to go down country with us quickly. So we moved down out of the Rift Valley of Ethiopia, down in the lower lands. My brother David went back to the boarding school. Instead of being with mom and dad in the dorm, he became a boarding school student. Plus, my brother Steve went a year later. As life in Ethiopia is totally different than life in North America. As 3-year-olds, we would get in all kinds of scrapes. We were supposed to be sleeping. We climbed out our window and went and built an irrigation ditch with a dam and everything so that we could play in the water and make mud pies. Also, another time we were in the backyard and army ants came through. Now, army ants can actually take a living animal down to bones in about an hour and a half. So we started screaming, and Mom's in the house, and she's hearing us screaming, and she comes running out and realizes that there's a swath of army ants going across the yard, and now they're all piling toward us. So throw on the gum rubbers, because they can't walk up gum rubbers. And my dad just picked us up and dunked us in these big barrels of water that they had to try and kill the ants. The army ants in Ethiopia are sometimes used as stitches, because when they bite, even when they're dead, they don't let go. That bite continues to hang on. So then they had to pick them all off of us, and I still have little scars where they bit hard enough that they pulled pieces of our skin off instead of being picked apart. So, but that didn't thwart us from playing in the backyard. So another day we were in the backyard, and all of a sudden my dad heard me yelling at something, and he looked out the window and there was a leopard coming right toward Ruth and I. Now we're 3-year-olds, we're the size of little monkeys. So the leopard thinks he's going to get a meal. Well, a monkey would turn and run from the leopard, and then the leopard would pounce. But I just stood there and hollered at it. Dad heard me hollering, grabs his gun, comes running out, and the leopard is turning around and running back into the woods. So I can say I have the power to ward off a leopard. Monkeys, we would be eating food, and if we happened to be near a window, the monkeys would try and come in and steal our food. Just lots of different memories of growing up as kids in a country where it's fun, right, Lydia? Yeah, monkeys, baboons, a little bit of everything. We would go to a lake, and my dad would go out in a rubber dinghy and get in the lake, and the hippos would get chasing us, and we thought that was really cool and fun till we came home to Canada, and later on my dad was at my house watching a National Geographic show, and he goes, "Oh," and they sent a rubber dinghy down a river in Africa, and the hippos just totally tore it to pieces. And he goes, I guess the Lord was looking after us, because the boat never stalled and we always kept ahead of the hippos, but the hippos are, more people are killed by hippos in Ethiopia than any other animal. It is a vicious animal. But we just thought it was fun, watching the hippos go after us in the lake. When we were 4, we came back to Canada for the first time for furlough for my parents. Now, my parents tried to describe to us snow. Now, all of us here have seen snow. Just imagine, and Lydia can attest to this too, try to explain snow to someone who has never seen snow. Right, Mathieu? Yes. It is very hard to do. Mom and Dad were trying to think of everything they could think of. Mom took us to the freezer and scraped off the icy snow on the side, put it in our hands, and she said, "Snow is kind of like this, but it's softer. And it falls from the skies, and it can get 3 feet deep." And all I'm thinking is water. I'm going to drown in snow. If it gets 3 feet deep, I am not 3 feet high. So, yeah, that was the first time we had ever seen snow. And just think of that when you're thinking of talking to people from another culture. It's something that you have to try and find something to bridge that gap, to try and figure out how you can explain something that's in your culture that's not in their culture, and vice versa. They're always trying to find things in their culture to bridge with you once you make a cross-cultural connection. When we were 6, we moved back to Canada because we had our birthday in between the time that we left Ethiopia and went back. And when we went back, of course, we were full grown, so Mom and Dad were sent back to the mission school, the Bingham Academy again. Dad was the maintenance director, and Mom was the school nurse, and they were also dorm parents. When we got back to Ethiopia, we used to have what we called verse group in the morning. At 6:30 every morning, all the students in the school would go to different areas of the school and start memorizing verses. If you learned so many verses, then you got an award, like to go on a trip or something like that. Well, one verse group, I was in the grade 1 classroom, and I was flipping a pencil constantly and distracting everybody around me because I'd already learned my verses. And so the teacher, Miss McDonald, said to me, "Rose, you're going to be staying after school today, and we need to discuss how you were acting today." So all through that day at school, I was just thinking, oh, and she was my teacher. So every little thing, I didn't want to volunteer for anything. I didn't want to give any answers. I was scared. I was like, what is she going to say to me? So she took me, after school, everybody left the classroom except me. She sat me at a desk and she goes, "I want you to think about what you did this morning after I told you numerous times to stop." And I thought, okay. And so the first thing, I'm so sorry I did that. And she said, "Do you know why we act the way we act? Because we all have a sin nature, and we're missing the mark that God has set for us." Well, in my mind, I was already a Christian. My parents were missionaries. That meant I was going to heaven. And she said, "No, you're not going to heaven unless you make it a personal relationship with Jesus Christ." And she was the first person that made me realize it wasn't about my parents' salvation. It wasn't about the fact that we were in a foreign country as missionaries and I was doing the good thing by being there. Not that I had much of a choice, but it was my decision to make, that I had to make that a personal relationship. So that's when I got saved, was when I was in grade 1 as a 6-year-old. And it was sin keeping me from God that just went boing, boing in my head, and it was sin making me act the way that I was acting. So that's when I made my decision for Christ. Because we were living in a totally Christian environment on the campus there at the school, we'd never heard swear words. We didn't. It was like a bubble, like the school here is. It's a place where you feel comfortable. Christianity was just kind of not something that you had to work to do. It was just kind of the way you were living your life. So I don't really remember any major things in my childhood that I was rebelling against, because I was in an atmosphere where the thought to me wasn't even there to rebel against something. In 1975, Haile Selassie was assassinated. He was the emperor of Ethiopia. And as soon as he was assassinated, there were 400 missionaries in Ethiopia at that time. This SIM headquarters in Toronto and the newly opened SIM headquarters in Sebring in the States thought that it was best to get all the white people out, because they knew that communism was coming in. They knew what had happened in other countries where communism had come in the 70s and 80s, like Russia continuing to go through like Czechoslovakia and those kinds of countries. So Romania, even though what we saw at the beginning here of school with the martyr, the Voice of the Martyrs, they knew that was coming for Ethiopia. For those who wanted to stand up for Christ, it wasn't going to be able to happen with the communists. So in 3.5 weeks, from 400 missionaries, it went down to 32. We were all shipped out to the States. So that was an abrupt change, because all of a sudden we're in Canada. And Canada is supposed to be our culture. But Canada wasn't my culture, because I had grown up in Ethiopia. This is my home country, because it's my parents' home country, but my home country was Ethiopia. So trying to figure out how to navigate life in North America. We had come, I don't know if any of you remember the famines of the 70s. There was a huge famine in Ethiopia in 1973, 74, 75. At the school, we had given up our money for having desserts at the school in order to pool the money, and we had a feeding program for kids that would come in off the streets. And we were in the city. We weren't even where the worst famine was, but there was still people having a really hard time even in the city. We would go down country and see people on the sides of the road who had died of starvation, cattle, just skin and bones. We came to North America, and if somebody didn't like their lunch that day, they were throwing it away. And we were just aghast because we had been where people were actually starving to death, dying, and it just seemed nobody cared, and everybody had this. It was what they said to us was, well, then pack the food up and send it to them. And in our minds, it was like, but don't you even care that people are dying and you have food and you're just throwing it away? Yeah, it's food. Let's just throw it away. We dress differently. We talk differently. We'd never heard swear words. My cousin was always trying to get us to say swear words by telling them in jokes that we didn't even know what was supposed to be funny in the joke, let alone that we were saying a swear word, not necessarily a swear word, because swearing is taking the name of the Lord in vain, but a vulgar word. And we would go home to Mom and Dad and say, Lord told us this, and Dad would say, well, this is the word that she wants you to say, but we don't say that word because it's not an appropriate word in our home. And we just couldn't figure out why somebody would try to get us to say stuff that wasn't nice to say. That was in Toronto. We went to school. We were there for a year. So then we came in 1976. My grandfather had a heart attack. And my grandfather at that time was not saved. And he had not been pleased with my dad for going to missions because he felt that Dad should have stayed and helped him in the shop because they had a business that was a machine shop. My grandfather had 40 women working at the machine shop during the war, making the cannonballs and whatnot. So it was a big machine shop and foundry. And Dad had felt the call to missions. So when Grampy called and asked Dad to take over the shop after his heart attack, Dad said, maybe this is a way that I can reach out to my own family. My dad doesn't know the Lord. So moved back to New Brunswick, and New Brunswick was much closer to Ethiopia than Toronto was. Bristol's on the river. It's not a big city. It's more like Toronto was. So he took over the shop from my grandfather, and we were now in this area, which is where my dad had grown up. In 1980, we came to our first teen retreat here at MBBI because we had a pastor at our church who was an MBBI grad. And at that retreat in 1980, Wayne Hakenin was speaking, actually, and who is now my pastor just up the road. But I rededicated my life to the Lord at that retreat in February of 1980, and my twin sister did too. We followed the Lord in the waters of baptism by identifying with Christ, saying we want to stand for Christ in June of 1980. So then I came to retreats for those 4 years, and in September of 1984, I enrolled here at MBBI. Well, I enrolled with Mrs. McMahon and my twin sister, and there are other people in this area who also came in 1984. And so we started school at MBBI. Now, I didn't have a great first year because my roommate was from New York City, and she was a brand new Christian. Well, I had been saved for a while, grew up in a Christian home. She hadn't. The very first night, she told me her testimony, and then she told me that she had stabbed someone. And I'm laying there in bed thinking, what? Where am I? This is supposed to be a Bible school, and this woman has stabbed somebody, and I'm her roommate for the year. So that was very much a complete growing time, because, I mean, she was from New York, and that's another big city. With not having grown up in a Christian home, she was totally different than anyone I had ever met. To pay off her schooling when we were here at school, Ruth and I, my twin sister and I, used to mow the lawns in the summer, strip and wax the floors all around campus, and just general maintenance. One year we put the roof on the Strauss guest home during the summer. And then we would spend 4 weeks during the summer at Miramichi Bible Camp for our practical Christian service credits that we needed for the summer. So it's still kind of the same now. You guys have to have practical Christian service credits during the summer, and that's what we did. Plus we worked here. So I kind of got used to the school. My brother was on staff. He used to live in the basement of the guys' dorm. So we would crawl through the window of his room up there in the basement to have lunches while we were working here in the summer. And then graduation was coming up in 1987, and I was thinking, what does the Lord want me to do? I have no idea. So I just left it in the Lord's hand. Dixie Lee Fried Chicken in Woodstock was needing staff. So I went and I started working there. And in August of that year, I got a call to go to the team office in Toronto, Oakville, to be their general office secretary receptionist. Well, when I started filling out my resume and sent it in, they said, you have no secretarial training at all. And I said, nope. I worked for the deans doing some of their paperwork while here at the school. I had answered the phone for the secretary during staff meetings while I was here at school, but I had no formal secretarial training. So that kind of fell through. I was still working at Dixie Lee, and in October, the secretary who was here called me, and she said she had gotten married in March. And she said, well, we're going to have a baby, and I'm going to need to go out on maternity leave, and I've put your name forward to be the secretary of the school. And I said, I don't have any secretarial training, and I've already had one job fall through here. And she said, no, I think you can do it, because computers were just coming in then, and I was quite computer savvy already because of my brother. But it was the kind of thing that I thought, well, if the Lord opens that door. So I interviewed with Mr. Ho, and it happened in December of 1987. I was oriented into the office, and then I started in January when Bev went out. So this has been a bonus to me to live here for the last 35 years when you include the 3 years of MBBI schooling. My brother's just up the hill, and this is the school where I rededicated my life to the Lord. It's been a big part of my life, probably more years here than I've lived anywhere else. In 1994, one of the local Gideons came by the school, and he said, I think that we need some Christians on the ambulance in Heartland. And I think he had presented it to the board at that time. And so 3 of us decided to take the course. Mr. Rushton, Terry Anger, which some of you know Terry Anger, and myself went and took the course to join the ambulance. This was my way, because I work in this bubble with Christians all the time, this was my way to be involved in the community, have a chance to meet up with people who aren't saved, have a chance to be with people in some of the worst times in their life, when they are struggling with sickness, illness, pain, whatever happens on an ambulance. So for the past 25 and a half years, I've worked on the ambulance evenings and weekends, and there have been all kinds of opportunities where the Lord has allowed me. Usually I work on a Saturday and Sunday, and people will say, well, I didn't see you. I have never met you before. And I said, well, I've worked for 25 years here. Well, I've never met you before. I said, well, I have a full-time job that I work at a Bible college. And as soon as I say Bible college, some of them will say to me, oh, so you're religious. And I said, it's not about a religion, it's about a relationship. And I've been able to share with people because they brought it up, asking me why they hadn't seen me before. I've had times that I've been able to pray with people on the ambulance when they were scared to death. Not Christians, but I've been able to pray for them and calm them down. And this to me is a way that, when you think about it, even if some of you go off into pastoral work, find some way that you can be part of your communities, volunteer firemen, whatever, where you can actually have an impact, besides being in a pulpit, have an impact working beside non-believers so that they can see Christ in you. I also attend the People's Church, as I said, just up the road here. My pastor is Wayne Hakenin at this time. I've been involved in the church since I moved here on campus. Awana leader for many years, Awana director. I worked in the nursery. I work with WMF. But it's just keep plugged into your home church, even if you do get into a situation that it just lay working. Keep plugged into your home church. Now, the fun part about being from Ethiopia and NBBI and missions is that we get to take a missions team back to Ethiopia, to some of the places where I grew up. And I talked about the school called Bingham Academy. And Bingham Academy is now not a school for missionaries' kids. It's an international Christian school where a lot of embassies send their ambassadors to Ethiopia, send their kids to this school. So it's a global outreach. They are not just teaching Ethiopians or the few missionaries that are in Ethiopia. They're teaching kids from China, Korea, North Korea, Holland, all over Africa, because Ethiopia is also the center of the African Union. There's a big place in Ethiopia where it's a compound where they meet for the African, what's it called? The African Union something. Yes, so a lot of the countries of Africa come to Ethiopia. So the Christian school at Bingham Academy is reaching out far beyond just being a Christian school, because a lot of these ambassadors are not Christians, but they're sending their kids there because the kids will get a Cambridge education, which is Cambridge from England, Cambridge. So I'm just going to show you a quick video of Bingham and leave you with my life verse first. My life verse is, "Therefore, my beloved brethren, be steadfast, unmovable, always abounding, for as much as ye know that your labor is not in vain in the Lord." 2 Corinthians 15:58. So you can go ahead and show.
Bingham's like one big community. My kids love to come to the school. It's very hard for me to take them home after school is over because they have great relationships with their teachers, they have great relationships with their peers, there's always activities that they would like to be part of or watch games. There's always something that's happening that they want to be part of. And the African saying, it takes a village to raise a child. And I feel like Bingham is that village for me, whether it's parents or teachers provide that kind of community where a child is nurtured and is able to grow and in a wholesome way, not just in academics.
Bingham Academy, more than a school, more than a mission. We are Bingham.